My name is Donna Cowan. I work at Stealth BioTherapeutics. We're a small biotech based just outside of Boston in Needham, Massachusetts, and our work is primarily in rare and ultra-rare disease. We currently have an NDA under review at FDA for Barth syndrome. I'm also the Associate Director of our Expanded Access Compassionate Use Program, and we did a panel on opening day here at World Orphan Drug Congress about the changing landscape of expanded access programs in and outside of the U.S. We all struggle with what we actually want to call it or refer to it as, and it's very important, especially outside of the U.S., that you choose the correct name. So here we refer to it as expanded access programs, which is what the FDA has also defaulted to. That's why we went that way. Probably more widely known as compassionate use programs, pre-approval access programs, post-approval access programs, managed access programs, many different names. Therapeutic use is another one. What that is a mechanism by which patients with life-threatening or serious diseases who have no options for treatment may be approved to use a drug that is not yet approved by any regulatory agency, FDA, EMA, any agencies outside the U.S. as well. The onus on doing that work is on the pharmaceutical company that is developing that drug. There are a lot of regulations around how you can administer this program, who can actually qualify to get a drug that's not yet approved. And it's a huge burden on these small biotechs, particularly as we are, because the drug is provided to these patients at no cost, and all the work and regulatory activities that surround that are on the shoulders of the biotechs providing that drug to the patients. And it's not just the cost of the drug, it's also the cost of administering these programs. For instance, most of what we do, we have to outsource because we're a very small company, so it's the cost of those vendors that are supporting us both from a regulatory aspect and a safety aspect, because we do have regulatory requirements to report the safety of our drug outside of our clinical trial area, in addition to our clinical trial areas. And it's also a burden on the sites because they're generally not compensated for the work they do for these patients. And if you go back to that second name that I said, compassionate use program, that's really what these programs are about. It's keeping the patient in mind, that disease community in mind, and just being able to get a drug that has a better potential benefit profile than risk to these patients that have no other option. These programs, expanded access, compassionate use, are not created to collect data. They're not research. It's not what some people perceive as an open label extension to a clinical trial, where when a trial completes, the subjects in that trial are rolled over to an open label extension. Everybody gets the active drug or device, whatever it is, and the companies will continue to collect data on those subjects while they're analyzing what happened in the clinical trial. This is very different from that. Again, its purpose is to allow a patient to get treatment, and the amount of data that we can collect in these programs is very limited. FDA understands that the general patient population in these programs is very different from the patients that are treated in a clinical trial. They're generally patients that would not qualify for a clinical trial, either because they're too ill, they don't live near a trial center, there may be other drugs that they can try that are approved, and they understand, as I said, that these patients are less well than patients that would qualify for a clinical trial. So the safety profile that comes out of an expanded access program does not, and FDA has acknowledged this, does not influence their review of that product or device when it does come to them for potential approval. There have been a very rare number of clinical holds placed on drugs because of evidence coming out of expanded access programs. In the history of this collection, it's less than a handful. And again, they were ultimately released back into trials, etc. So it wasn't an overall stop on development of a drug. We do have certain types of events that need to be reported, and we do that diligently. It's a very gratifying place to be in from a work standpoint. Our program at Stealth is, we like to call it small but mighty, because of the diseases that we treat with our drug, genetically confirmed mitochondrial diseases for the most part. We know that these patients have no other option, so it's the perfect place for an expanded access program. Our major candidate right now is called Elamipretide. It's a daily subcutaneous injection, and the primary indication that we're looking at right now is Barth syndrome. Barth syndrome is an ultra-rare disease. It's a devastating cardiomyopathy. The gene defect is carried by the mother. It affects boys, and many of these boys do not live past the age of 10. It affects them in many ways, primarily in the heart, but also with severe fatigue, weakness. One of the biggest challenges is that up until fairly recently it was much more difficult to diagnose these boys with Barth syndrome. They were misdiagnosed or undiagnosed. A lot of times failure to thrive was the first thing that came up. But because of new technology in genome sequencing and newborn screening, we're finding that these boys, when there's a suspicion that there's a heart problem, when perhaps they have a history in the family of an uncle or a grandfather or an older sibling having died from some unknown, perhaps, cardiac issue, if that suspicion is there, these babies are getting tested and finding out that yes, they do have Barth syndrome. So part of what we talked about at the opening session here at World Orphan Drug Congress was the changing landscape of expanded access programs. And Stealth's expanded access program has changed significantly. This year alone, we've had, since the end of January, we've had 4 requests in babies under the age of 1 for treatment for Barth syndrome. We've had some wonderful success stories over the last year or two. There's one that is all over the internet. The little boy's name is Declan. He came in unresponsive to Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and he's now 2.5 years old. He's a normal 2.5-year-old and thriving on our drug Elamipretide. Some stories are not quite as happy as that, but we're very pleased with what we've seen so far. That drug NDA, drug application for approval, about 2.5 years ago we submitted to FDA and they refused to file, and we had to go back to the drawing board. Thankfully, at the end of January this year, we were able to submit a supplement to that NDA with additional data from what I spoke about earlier, an open label extension to our phase 2/3 Barth syndrome trial. So that's sitting with FDA right now. We are very, very close partners, or they have partnered with us, the Barth Syndrome Foundation, in supporting us through this. There's been a lot of noise made to FDA, in Congress, by the families. The burden of this disease is immense. It's immense on the children, on the families, on the healthcare system. So what we're looking for is to support these families and potentially give them something that shows that yes, there is a way for these boys to thrive and do well and live fairly normal lives. The Barth Syndrome Foundation and these families are amazing. They actually were the impetus for Stealth to begin developing a drug for Barth syndrome several years ago, and they've been extremely supportive, as I said, of us, of our programs. There's sort of a network out there of these Barth patients and families that communicate with each other all of the time. And what happens is someone tells someone, or they're at a meeting. We have a couple of sort of experts in the Barth system area who will refer other doctors to us. We have a very, very nuanced process, and that's what's happened to a lot of small biotechs as diseases have been diagnosed earlier in children, especially these rare and ultra-rare diseases, and the treatments have become more sophisticated. The diseases themselves have become more heterogeneous, is what we see. The range of how this disease affects boys is very, very wide. And that was actually one of the issues that we had with FDA the first time around. The patient population in our phase 2/3 trial is not the same as the patients that we're treating now. That trial was for ages 12 and above, And as I mentioned, we're now seeing these requests and providing this treatment for children much younger. It is a burden on the sites that do these treatments because they are the ones that have to request approval from FDA to use this treatment. What we're looking as we treat in expanded access, I mentioned, it's a small amount of data that we can collect, but what we're looking for is to inform this treatment process for these boys and also in our other primary mitochondrial myopathies such as POLG. We're just completing a phase 3 trial in that. That's a mitochondrial-based disease. Also with Elamipretide, we have other compounds in our labs now that we hope will come forward for some of the other mitochondrial-based diseases, as well as a program that we're starting now in age-related dry macular degeneration. We have 2 phase 3 trials kicking off in that as we sit here. So there's a lot going on at Stealth. But really, we're looking for these Barth kids and the older, the teenagers, as well as the older patients that came out of that trial who are still on treatment now, running on 5, 6, some of them years on our treatment. We're looking to see what the outcomes are. What was the plan in mind for these babies that are admitted in an emergency situation to a hospital, discovered out of nowhere perhaps that they have Barth syndrome? What were you planning? Did you think that you were going to have to put in a ventricular assist device? Did you think this child was going to go on the heart transplant list? If you used our treatment, what came out of that surprised you? Did that outcome change from what you thought the plan was going to be? So it will inform the whole community. Our partners in the Barth Syndrome Foundation are very excited about this, looking for that information as well to come out of this program. And if FDA pays attention to the community and their needs and wants, perhaps they'll see a path forward for approval for this drug, and we'll be able to help a much wider population, which is what we would like to do. Wider is relative in the Barth syndrome community. We suspect that there's probably less than 150 boys affected in this country and a worldwide population of probably under 700. Going back to the discussion about Barth syndrome and the Barth community supporting us with this time that we're under review at FDA. At a recent meeting in January, I had the opportunity to ask Dr. Califf, Commissioner of FDA, about FDA's ability to use regulatory flexibility in reviewing applications for drugs in rare and ultra-rare diseases. And his answer was very encouraging because he said FDA does need to use regulatory flexibility and creative approaches for these rare and ultra-rare diseases where it's almost impossible, especially for a small biotech and a small population, as I just mentioned, in Barth syndrome, to do a phase 3 clinical trial. There just aren't enough patients to power something well enough to actually get an outcome that FDA would want to see from a clinical trial. So the major question that I asked him was, if FDA does not see a pathway forward for approval for this drug in Barth syndrome, where they have already approved its use in our expanded access program into several treating physicians who applied to them individually for an emergency IND to use this treatment, if they don't see a pathway forward for approval, what happens to these patients that we're currently treating on Elamipretide that are having positive outcomes on it? And for that, he said, I don't have a clear answer.